Yeah, how's everyone? Thanks for joining
Good.
uh, our race this morning. My name's Colin Kinchilla. I'm a Gomorrah man from northwest New South Wales. Less than a week ago, the Morrison government has been given the last stage approval, environmental approval for a gas project in the homelands of my people in and around the town and township of Narrabri. The Gomeroi Nation and its people, my people, have a very strong connection, uh, spiritual and ancestral, to the area known as the Pilliga State Forest. Many cultural focal points involving creation, my dreaming stories, defined men and women areas, and hunting areas are known to us and lay within this forest area. So, in this forest area, the oil and gas company will be drilling an area about 1,000 hectares in total from official reports. And these significant locations of my culture are going to be disrupted and mostly be destroyed. There will be contamination on the groundwater and the waterways. There has been very little engagement from mob about our cultural significance in the areas outlined. There's no consideration to the environmental impact that drilling into the earth will cause and have effect to my peoples. The Morrison government has stated there's been consultation, but to whom? And we know what that means. I'm a storyteller. I consider myself a storyteller since when I was a little boy, wanting to have my voice heard, needing to tell and share my experiences and what it's like to be Gumoroy. I give respect to the ancestors that came before me, to the elders of the community that we have with us, to the elders and people of the lands that I reside in now, in Barramadigal land, in the Darug Nation, and the First Nation peoples that are joining us this morning for this workshop. We have a voice. We always did. It's the digital age, and we're not going to stop fighting for what's right. This is my homeland of my people, my bloodline, and the artesian base that is the Pilliga. It's sacred. It's hoped that next year the oil and gas producers of the South Pacific, the Santos, will see reality of what drilling for oil and gas will do to the environment of my country. This update has only been in the news less than a week. I suggest to you all to look up some of my people's responses online, outlining this marked environmental cataclysm. There's a National Day of Action this Thursday in all major cities, in Sydney, in Brisbane, in Canberra, and I encourage you all to get involved and attend in some capacity. That's my acknowledgement of country to you all. And I hope First Nation peoples will take the opportunity to reframe what an acknowledgement of country is. It's getting First Nation people to share where they're from, of course, their ancestral lands, but also to share with you all what's happening on those country and on those lands. So what's happening on your countries? Connectedness through allyship goes beyond just having a First Nation person conduct an acknowledgement of country. Yeah. It requires further commitment. And I suggest to you all to use your privilege to connect, to support, and align yourself with First Nation people and the causes, because it affects us all. And this is my acknowledgement of country this morning. This is why and how I choose to give my acknowledgement. Marabaginda, thank you. And as we do with all our race workshops and webinars, we start off with this acknowledgement and acknowledgements, but also then we start getting the participants, all of you there joining us this morning, to put in where you're connecting us from, where you're connecting us to from this morning, and put that in the chat box. My engagement with our race has been about 2 years. And the concept of being a storyteller, as I was saying, has been with me, with my culture, with the industry that I've worked with as a professional, most of my adult life. So yeah, I'll share with you a bit more about my journey with our race a bit further on this morning in the workshop. So thank you again, Maraba Ginda. Maraba Bulyagu is good morning. So Maraba Bulyagu to Doug. How are you, brother, this morning?
Maraba Bulyagu. Colin, I'm good. And nice to see everybody here, either for the first time or again. And thank you for the acknowledgement, Colin. It's something that Colin and I speak about a lot, about the lack of acknowledgement or the lack of feeling and acknowledgement. One of the key things that we always talk about is trying to understand the deepness of the story and look behind the curtains of what's happening. And that's what we're hoping to look at today. We've unfortunately seen some very unethical storytelling practices. So over the last 2 years or so, we've been trying to work out how can we develop more ethical practices. And so what we've been able to do for you today, and what we wanted to discuss, was how can we implement, how can we use a framework, how can we develop strategies so that storytelling, as we say, we can flip the pyramid of power of storytelling, because we acknowledge that storytelling is powerful, but there are also power dynamics of who gets to tell a story, where they get to tell the story, and who benefits from the story. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to invite a few people who have actually been using this framework in different ways and the principles, and to provide a little bit about what it means to them, how they're using it, and then giving you an opportunity to ask questions.
Yeah, I'm originally from Burundi. I'm not sure if everyone knows where is Burundi. That will be the quiz for this morning. And yeah, I came to Australia back in May 2013. And since then, I've been asked to share my story of seeking asylum. For me, storytelling didn't start here. It starts back home. It's a part of our culture. It has been used since I don't know when. I'm coming from our ancestors were from oral tradition. So storytelling was used to educate children around the fire, elders sharing the stories, wisdom to the kids, just to pass the wisdom to the next generation and educate people. So I believe it's the same thing for many cultures across Africa and the continent in different ways, different shapes. But my focus here will be on the aspects of ethical storytelling. So for me, this was an opportunity to put me back in the driver's seat, to own my story and feel comfortable to share what I'm comfortable with. This approach and methodology of our race about flipping the power, it's very important for people like me because sometimes it may be an unconscious bias, but we feel some pressure or burden of having the role and the responsibility to educate mainstream, or also we don't know. Personally, when I was asked to put my story in writing, I didn't know what was the aim of that, where my story will end if I put in writing in the share a hard copy or a soft copy. So maybe that was also another personal or cultural barrier, because what I went through, we also have this issue of trust. Yeah, trust is a very valuable asset, but unfortunately for people like me who have been tortured, put in jail for our opinions, we lose this trust, unfortunately, trust towards organizations, trust towards institutions. So to cut the story short, I am very glad to be part of this journey to promote and encourage ethical storytelling.
Sharing a story requires really the courage, the strength, and commitment, but more importantly, support. I learned that my story is powerful and I should own my story, and no one has the control of my story. And my story is not just a story, but it has to have a purpose. So before I joined our race, I was not really sure about why I should be telling the story. I was like, feel like pressured to tell my story. So, but after meeting our race, they helped me to identify the purpose of sharing story, the powerful of a story, how it can change people or how it can affect the society. So now I do have a purpose of sharing story, which is impacting people and have that capacity of making sense throughout my story. I do believe that every single story we share has the potential to convey the struggle, the value, the culture, the failure, the advocacy, and the hope, and can really promote the unity among us and our society. So the story we share is a reflection of what has happened to us and what we learned and what others can learn from us sharing the story. So I really learned a lot, but the most important part from our list that has impacted me is community of practice, because most of the time as storytellers, we don't get the chance to listen to other people's stories or other people's experience. And I think that for you to be able to be a good storyteller, you have to also be a good listener. So through our community of practice, we get a chance to listen to other people's story and we see the similarities. And when we share our story among us in a safe environment, we do get a chance to learn from others and to feel less alone through our stories. I would encourage other organizations that have storytellers to tell the storytellers the opportunities that they may get through sharing the stories, but also the risk involved in sharing the stories, because through sharing the stories, there might be some risk, but some are not aware of those risks before they decide. So it's really important for other organizations if they can really let the storytellers know the risks that involve through sharing the story and how they can get support if they want to.
So now the challenges, I will mention only two main ones. I think I've already shared one about when I was asked to share my story in a hard copy and in a soft copy on a memory stick. I said, oh, what are they going to do this? I asked them, can you please delete my name and put X or Y? Because I don't know where it was going to end up. especially if it was in a Word version, not even a PDF. So then the biggest and the worst challenge for me was when I was at the tribunal, the AAT, the member, the tribunal member, the judge, I mean, she was quizzing me the first day, second day. She wanted to give me a third day. And in the midst of those interviews at the tribunal, not at the immigration, at the tribunal, she put in her, somewhere from her drawer, she put a paper and showed me, said, this is you. You wanted to share your story at Vivid Ideas 2016. You are raising your profile. I was like, what? That really shocked me. Because I've been on a panel as a part of Vivid Ideas 2016, it was a request from my employer. My boss was a tenderer. He got a bid. He won the tender to run Vivid Ideas 2016. It was an agency, an organization specializing in branding and strategy communication. And I was working for them as a researcher. And part of that job, they asked me to go on the panel. Of course, I also helped them to recruit participants, but they asked me to go on the panel and share my story as a panelist. I did because it was a request from my boss, but I also did it because I like sharing my story. Then I didn't know that a year later, that will backfire. And being quizzed by a judge of the AAT, Administrative Appeal Tribunal, interviewing me for my visa to show that paper and telling me, convincing me that I was on that panel to raise my profile. I was like very upset. So that was really a dark moment for me. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for listening. And every story needs a listener. Thank you for being here today.
I just want to thank the City of Sydney for creating an opportunity for us to discuss this, because it's not often that such controversial conversations can take place. And I want to acknowledge that before I, more importantly, acknowledge the land that I'm joining you on from digitally, which is the land of the Baramatagal people of the Darug Nation. I also want to observe, following on from what Colin said earlier, that I live on Parramatta River, and where it's no longer, where fishing is not allowed. It's not allowed because the water is polluted. It's polluted because next to me is the Newington Armory, where napalm was made for the Vietnam War. All that land is still polluted. Aboriginal people can no longer catch eel from the river where they traditionally used to catch eel. That's why Parramatta is called after the Aboriginal word Baramatagal, which means the land of where eels sit or lie. I'm probably not translating it correctly, but it's just I think an important observation, considering that when you walk around Parramatta River, you don't see a lot of Aboriginal people today. And also, when you statistically look up statistics, you see that the greatest population of Aboriginal people in this area is in Silverwater, where we have Silverwater Prison, which is the state of things at the moment. I think just through statistics, we can say how like humanitarian disasters and environmental disasters can end up, and these statistics are often ignored. And the fact that about 3.5 million Vietnamese people died in the Vietnam War, and I'm not saying that all the napalm produced here was responsible for all of that, but these are just some narratives that we often ignore in our public domain, because the stories that we get to hear are highly curated by neoliberal capitalism. So I won't talk about that anymore. One thing that I would like to acknowledge Colin and Tammy in the room, who are both Aboriginal peers here and colleagues. And it's impressive to see that, that there are still ways of sharing important messages and advocating on behalf of important causes, like the fight of the Gamilaroi people. And I encourage you all to support that and to prevent further natural disasters as much as we all can. I got involved in the ethical storytelling initiative accidentally. I saw a Mayan meeting invite to come to the pilot to actually an introduction by our race. And to me, that the term ethical storytelling sounded interesting in itself, because I've never thought about it that way. Stories today have become a commodity, and they always tend to get packaged, and someone tends to pay for them. I look at it from the perspective of art history. I have an art history major, and when you analyze an artwork, you always look at the wider context, socioeconomic context, and you ask yourself, who funded this artwork? Because who funded the artwork will tell you more about it than who produced it. That's the way art history is approached. And I think that we forget to do that when it comes to storytelling today, because stories get highly manipulated and packaged to serve the purpose of the person who commissioned the story, or who shared the story, or appropriated someone else's story. So at Story Factory, where we see about 1,100 young people per week across schools and community organizations around Sydney and wider New South Wales, it's very important to think about the way we share young people's stories, because we get very sensitive stories all the time. And from our partner organizations, or funders, we get requests to focus on Aboriginal stories, to focus on refugee stories, to focus on LGBTQI stories sometimes, because to someone that's important. They have a mission, and which is a good thing. Every organization should be driven by a mission, but is that the best thing for the young person that we work with? Often that's not the case. And so we have been struggling with this tension for the past few years, at least I'm aware of it since I joined Story Factory close to 4 years ago. So the ethical story framework put everything into perspective for me. Like it became the thing that joined all the dots, where I realized this is how we could navigate this space. This is like, we need a framework for this in order not to get caught out and not to make compromises anymore. So one of the most important conclusions for me, which Doug mentioned in that first introduction, was that most of the stories that get packaged today are individual stories of individuals, but rarely do we focus on communities, because neoliberalism doesn't like collectivism. We're always looking at that personal story of, for example, drug addiction, and how I overcame drug addiction, and now I'm a successful real estate agent, or something like that. This is how Hollywood is structured. These are the narratives that we get told. But if we avoid collective stories, then we also avoid big political and social injustice that exists in our society. So that was interesting for me, because I started paying attention to a lot of the commonalities in the narratives that our kids were writing, and across Sydney. And so I went back into our organization and spoke to my colleagues and said, look, we really have to get involved in this and go to this pilot and see how we create a framework for ourselves internally. Because we've got to safeguard the stories of our young people like this. We have to be completely legit. So what we did is we created an internal framework, like a guideline for our fundraising team, which developed a guideline on what grants to apply for, how to write applications, and how to write acquittals. The basic rule is that you always write about young people as if they will be reading that piece of information. You never use stigmatizing language or say anything that could sound inappropriate to them. The second thing was, once we spoke to our community partners, we moved away from the word of marginalized. We used to say we work with marginalized young people. And to us, it made a lot of sense because we thought that their voices are marginalized due to socioeconomic reasons. People didn't like the sound of it. So we moved away to the word under-resourced. So people suggested we should say we work with under-resourced communities, because that puts the focus away from the individuals we're working with to communities which have a lack of resources. And when you go to suburbs in Mount Druitt, you see a lack of infrastructure straight away. There's a lack of phone reception. You can't make a phone call. You can't call an ambulance. There's a lack of public transport. So these are not the responsibilities of the people who live in that community. And so that was an important shift for us. We went back and looked at our content policy. So what content will we publish that young people write? And sometimes you get inappropriate content, but we wanted to be respectful. And when we originally say to young people, you're given an opportunity to elevate your voice here, to honor that. But then we also started talking to them about their responsibility as authors. So two things that we censor, which we can say openly, are graphic sexual violence, which may trigger someone because it's so descriptive, and graphic and detailed suicide and self-harm content. So young people in our workshops can write about these issues and about everything else in society, but they also understand that they have a responsibility to the readers, because our books are available at libraries, they're sold in our bookshops, and we share them around. Sometimes young people want to still keep the story that they wrote down, which we agree, but we don't then publish that and promote it widely. But we have these open discussions with them, and this is especially for young people in our open programs, which are year-long after-school programs. Other changes that we made were that we no longer just take photographs of storytellers and then share them on our social media. In the past, schools would give us photographs of kids who wrote stories and would say, all of these kids have full permission, you can freely publish their photographs and then their stories alongside that. We realized that this wasn't ethical, because the schools get permission at the beginning of a term or at the beginning of the year. It's a blanket permission, but the children and their families don't really understand how this is used. So now we create special permission forms, send it to all the kids and their families, explain it if it needs explaining. It's all in simple English. And we only publish photographs of stories of these kids if we get them back. And we have a limited number of these photo shoots that we organize now. And only if we have full permission from families, obviously. Also, we often get asked by our partner organizations to ask the refugee kids to talk about their experience in the war or their journey. That's a very popular, narrative, and we push back really hard when it comes to that, because we've seen how refugee kids get traumatized by being forced to talk about their trauma when they are not ready, where it's still raw. And we have a rule that kids shouldn't write about a trauma in our workshops if it's still causing them distress. So all of these guidelines were developed in collaboration with a psychologist and other consultants as well. And we also have, if we need to assess how appropriate content is for publishing, we sort of put together a panel which looks at the writing and then decides how ethical it is. And that panel may invite external people who are experts in that community or around a certain issue as well. So a lot of these, as I said, the ethical storytelling pilot was brilliant because it sort of made us realize that all of these things are linked and that they all need to come together to create a framework. And the main challenge is that this cost us a lot of money. Like it was expensive to implement all of this. The good thing was that we have a very supportive board and they were willing to do that. I mean, it has cost us thousands of dollars. to make these changes, especially when we're creating videos and short films and giving young people the final cut, or like, you know, paying for editing hours. It costs a lot of money. And also designing an annual report or another publication with someone's photo in it, and then showing it to young people, and they say, I don't like it, I don't want it in there, and then having only a few hours to go back to an editor or a designer and change all of this does cost a lot of money, but it was a cost we were prepared to take on because we thought that it was very important to do that. Our board now as well gets together to analyze all major funders as well, to see how ethical it is to take money from certain corporate funders or philanthropic organizations. I just wanted to share like a recent example where we worked on a big creative writing workshop, which culminated in a professionally published book. And we, as a part of that project, we worked with 120 Koori kids, Aboriginal kids from across New South Wales. And our partner organization, which was an Aboriginal organization, said to us that they are having a hard time getting permissions from families to publish the books, to publish the stories in the final book. And we made a call together not to publish these 120 stories as a part of the collection. Although we could have done that anonymously and that could have protected the kids, we thought that, you know, there is a spiritual component here. A kid is passing down a narrative which they may have received from a parent or another elder or someone in the community. It is unethical. We need to acknowledge not just the asset in this, the material component, but also the spiritual component. And so we agreed not to publish that. We published 120 separate books for all of these kids so that they got their own copy with their name, and so that they could show it to their family and they could be proud of it. But their names and their stories were not included in the final big publication. Another interesting challenge that came up recently was that a funder engaged a filmmaker to interview me for a promotional video. And in this interview, the filmmaker kept on suggesting to me that I should say certain things about the communities that we work with. And I constantly kept on pushing back and ignoring what that person was saying to me. There was ongoing tension. It was like a tennis match between the two of us, until that person finally said to me, look, can you just say this? This would sound really good. And told me exactly what to say and the way I should label that community. So I said, great. So I answered, but not saying that, obviously saying it in the way that I see that, which frustrated this person so much. But that person was sidetracked by the fact that behind me, there was an image of Porky the pig, the cartoon character, which has a copyright attached to it. And so this filmmaker panicked so much because that could cost a lot of money in appropriating that corporate image of Porky the pig. And at the same time, they cared so much about a corporate image, but completely disregarded the feelings of a community or broader ethnic and cultural groups that we work with. And it's an interesting paradox that we come across all the time. So I see this ethical storytelling framework as a really important thing for all of us to embrace and to turn it into something that works for all of us. I like the idea of getting it like certified organic, getting a stamp where you get a stamp for being a certified ethical storyteller, because this exists for, you know, child safe organizations. It exists for accounting firms. That it sort of dictates a level of standard, and it means that you have to get audited occasionally to make sure that your stories are told ethically. So that's it in a nutshell for me. And I think that I might answer these questions later when we are answering all our questions. So thank you all very much.
Thanks very much for such good question. I started sharing my story when I was very young, so I knew nothing about why I should be sharing my story apart from just being being invited and go and present the story, and that's it. So after I keep sharing my story, I said to myself, why really do I need to share my story? What are the benefits for me to share my story, or what am I gaining from sharing the story, or what other people are sharing, I mean, are getting from my story. So when I met Hourless, I met different guest speakers who do share their stories professionally and have had very, very good experience. So they really helped me to understand the value and powerful of my story. Then from there, I chose to have a purpose, which is a positive purpose. Before I was taking my history or my experience as a negative thing or as a weakness, but now I do understand that it's not a weakness, it's the courage, it's the strength, it's not that it's a weakness, but it's a strength that I carry on myself and be where I am today. And I can use that story to impact other people who have the same experience as myself, and others who also do not have that experience, that they can learn that even if you don't have such experience, even if you are, maybe you've been in a good life, you've been in a safe country, that the other countries that have never been safe since maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, like in my country, has never been safe since my parent was born. So that's for Australian or for other people whose country has been safe, it's really hard for them to understand. So for me, sharing a story is not just coming and attend the event and I'm gone. It's what the people learn from my story. What is the takeaway after hearing my story? And that is acknowledging that you are lucky to be where you are, but you have the responsibilities also to respect and have dignity for other people's and have empathy for people who have certain background. So basically that's the purpose for me to share my story, is just that it's not a weakness for me, but it's a strength, and it's the courage and it's a heroism that I carry myself to be in such a situation for more than the age that I am. I won't say my age, but yeah, but that's the purpose for me. And that's what I tell my storytellers as well, is that you need to have a purpose of sharing your story. You don't need to come and speak and you are gone, but you need to have the message that people will take away after listening to your story, because our stories are really powerful if we do believe they are. They won't be powerful, they won't have a meaning, they won't be as strong as they are unless we do believe and share our stories in a sense that really communicate our values, in a sense that unite us than separate us, in a sense that show us who we are and represent us in our community.
Sure. Thanks, Do, and thanks, everyone. Thanks, Vincent. Thanks, Nick, for those powerful insights. It's amazing. Yes, yeah, it's really a good question. There are a lot of valuable things. It's actually a rewarding opportunity to share the story for me, because first of all, it allows me to live my culture. It's a part of my culture to share the story, to tell the story. Also, it's also for me, helps me to feel I belong to a community of other people who are doing the same things. So it's not only me. When I go to a school and I'm not the only presenter or storyteller, there are also other storytellers. So I feel, oh, I'm not alone. It's not about me. It's not only me. So I feel I belong to at least a certain community, even if it's a group or a community of people who have been through hardships, but there are other people. It helps me to feel normal. Yeah, and the other thing for me, not the least important, is when I go to an event where Together for Humanity invites together 3 schools, kids from a Muslim school, an Islamic school, other kids from a Jewish school, and those kids, seeing those kids together, playing together, for them, they've never thought or met. See, some kids, when they share the feedback after the session, say, oh, I've never shaken the hand of a Muslim person. I've never shared a conversation with a Jewish kid. So for me, I have the feeling that we are educating the future leaders, the future generations. I'm sure from those children, those students, one of them will be the prime minister. They will be ministers, they will be prosecutors. So we are really, no doubt, we are contributing to educating those young, those future leaders. So the other important thing for me, I got job opportunities through those sessions of sharing my story. I got outstanding and powerful, strong friendship, the opportunity to share my story for Together for Humanity. I came across someone, a very informal table talk, and one of the ladies who was there was the program manager for Together for Humanity. After listening to me, he said, oh, actually, you will be a good fit for our program. Can you join us and do this? Tell me more, I'll be more than interested. So all those good causes that we are working along, supporting, I really live in hope and expect the best, that we are making an impact. We may not see the outcome straight away, but I'm a social and a clinical psychologist. Sometimes impact is not immediate, it's not straight away. Thank you very much.
That point is completely right. It's not just sharing. I mean, sharing in sociology, reciprocity is one of the main requirements of for the creation of social capital or a community. So when I share something of my own, which is personal, and then you share something back, this is how we develop a bond and we feel a sense of membership to the same community. That's how human nature works. That's why yarning circles are important in communities, in our First Nation communities here. So that sharing component is very important, but it's only maybe the actual, it ignores the root. Everything else that comes before a story is ready to be shared. We do involve young people in our frameworks. But it's not as straightforward as that, because whenever we've asked young people to get involved in a policy like discussion, they were so bored that they just completely ignored us or said, look, I can't talk about this. But so we frame it differently. We have a charter of rights for young people, which they defined with us, which states what their rights are at Story Factory, what they how they want to be treated, and what they should have rights to, and it includes some responsibilities as well. So this guides our principles when it comes to working with young people, and like a feedback loop is an important aspect of this. In every young person who participates in our workshops gets an opportunity to provide feedback at the end, at least once, but also ongoingly during every session. Every time we receive feedback, we analyze that and look at how we should implement it in our whole system, so that we capture everything and inform our policies, update them, or like our procedures. And so we have done that, like we do that all the time, especially for our school workshops, where we have standardized like surveys, which are not really surveys. They have some visual elements where you circle things for primary school kids and scales, but then you can also provide feedback. And they are anonymous as well. So we do get negative feedback as well. It's mostly about the way someone is dressed or something like that, not about the way we deliver workshops, but we do get very important feedback. For young people who participate in our open programs, which are after school workshops where we have a direct relationship with them without an intermediary, like a school or a community organization. We have much longer conversations with them, and we explain to them all aspects of what it means to represent Story Factory in front of an audience. We prepare them for this. We discuss the consequences of them sharing their story or reading something that they wrote, which reveals a personal trauma or an ailment or something that bothers them. And we make sure that they are aware of all potential consequences, how their family may react, how their peers may react, how like someone in the media may react, especially if their story will be shared. So we have these long conversations, we prepared them, and a lot of these things did come, like a stronger framework came after the ethical storytelling pilot. So, and that's when they also, we explain to them our existing policies, and then they provide feedback and they say, well, I don't like that aspect of that. I think you should do this differently. And so we continuously evolve all of these documents. They change all the time. They're not set and like stamped and then they stay the way they are. They are continuously evolving. So that's how we involve them in the process.
Great, thanks, Nicola. And I think that the importance of the ever-evolving part of it all, like it's, you can't be static. And I think this is what we've found, and through conversations that we continually have with Nicola, with Colin, with other people, Raphael, Vincent, is it can't just stay static. It's always changing. But I think also that, you know, it might cost more money to begin with trying to find it, but what is the potential negative impact if we don't do it properly? And I think we've seen that too many times. And we also didn't understand how much of an impact it could have based on the law, based on copyright, intellectual property. And we had no experience in this area. And so some of you might remember from the workshop in July and August, we talked about that we're engaging with a law firm to support us in this. And the law firm that have been supporting us have been incredible, Mark Lawyers. And we have two of the lawyers from Mark Lawyers who will discuss the legal framework that they've been developing in collaboration with us. You know, the whole thing about collaboration is how can we do it together and better?
Well, Emily does that. I just want to say thank you to all the speakers so far. Your experiences have been really valuable for us to hear, so thanks for that. And thanks, Doug, for inviting us today. So as Doug said, this is Emily and I'm Jen, and we're from Mark Lawyers, and we've been working with RACE for a little while now, just developing this framework, which is a document that's going to guide and inform how organizations and storytellers work together. Starting with looking at what's the issue, and I think that just listening to all the speakers today, we can all get a sense of the fact that there are some complexities and challenges. One of them being that there's a huge power imbalance between storytellers and organizations. And as lawyers, our focus is really on the law and how the law can or not protect storytellers and their stories. And one of the problems is that the way that the law works at the moment, there's very little a storyteller can do in terms of redress if an organization misuses their story or their appearance. And really there's kind of not much that they can do to protect them, other than, I guess, contractually, and Nicola, you touched on this, dealing with it in a permission form or a consent up front. But the issue with that is that that really places the onus on the storyteller to first understand what rights they should be including in that document they're signing up front. And second, it places the onus on them to negotiate if they're not happy with the way that the terms are drafted. And as you can imagine, that's really not really done very often. And we asked Doug to share a story with us that we could use as a case study, just to kind of walk through and demonstrate the types of issues that often come up. So we're going to talk about a man named Michael, and he was forced to leave his home country over 7 years ago, and he now lives in Australia. He often gets invited to share his refugee background, which I think is a common experience, as again, we heard from the speakers today. At first, he was happy to do it, but over time, he started to find that he was getting tired of sharing the same story over and over, And also the trauma of having to relive the painful details of his story started to get to him. So he decided he was going to stop sharing that story, and he stopped accepting invites. One of the organizations that had helped him early on really persisted, even though he declined the initial invitation to speak. And it seemed like, from my perspective, they were really kind of throwing it into space, the fact that he helped them early on, and said, you know, even though we've helped you, you can't spare a few minutes of your time to come and speak and explain, you know, your story. So even though he wasn't really willing to, he agreed to do it. And on the day, Michael was introduced as a refugee from Congo, but there was no reference to his professional work or any of his volunteering experience. And even though in his speech, he talked about many different things, including the challenges he faced in Australia, racism that he's experienced. He also talked about leaving his home country, and he talked about the benefits and the positives of the organization. But it was, you know, he spoke about challenges and he spoke about the good experiences. Afterwards, he saw a film that was produced of the event, and he realized that his story was edited and it took it out of context, and it made it look like he was saying that his home was a terrible place and that Australia and the organization had saved him. And that's not the way that he had presented his story on the day. He wasn't given an opportunity to review the video, and it was made public. So of course, he's a bit weary of sharing his story following that experience. And I guess the difficulty from a legal perspective is there's very little that Michael could do, particularly if he signed kind of one of the standard consent forms, again, that Nicola spoke about earlier, where it just kind of waives all your rights. So in terms of intellectual property, and Emily will go into this in a little bit more detail shortly, the copyright ownership actually attaches to the author of the copyright work. So in this case, the organization probably would have paid someone to take the film. So the organization owns the IP in it, the intellectual property in it, which means they have the exclusive right to kind of publish it, use it, share it, do whatever they want with it. And even though Michael features in it, he doesn't have a say over that. In Australia, there's no publicity or personality rights. So there's no general right to privacy that he could rely on. And in terms of defamation, that's only really relevant if the publication lowers the public's opinion of him. So again, I don't think that was really relevant in this situation. So this doesn't really give him much opportunity to kind of do anything about the fact that he's not happy with the film. So this is where the framework comes in. And the way it's set up is really kind of twofold. It aims at setting out a set of principles which organizations that would like storytellers to come and share their stories with, they'll sign up to these principles, which really kind of, I guess, allow them to consider some of the ethical considerations involved in storytelling. And the second part of the framework really sets out the legal principles that underlie storytelling. And it's really aimed at informing a storyteller about how they could protect their rights. So Emily's going to chat you through some of the legal framework, and then I'll briefly talk about the principles.
So we thought we'd start with a general explanation of IP. And intellectual property protects the expression of a new and original idea, but it doesn't protect the idea itself. So if we take the example of Harry Potter, for example, anyone can write a story about a boy wizard. It's just that you can't reproduce the actual Harry Potter books without consent. IP protects the originality of your expression and helps to stop people from copying your work. And you can also transfer or assign IP ownership to other people. But in Australia, our IP laws only protect individuals and entities that have a legal personality. So those that can enter into binding contracts, which means, quite importantly, they don't recognise any communal rights or that a story might belong or be owned by an entire community. There are a few different types of IP. Trademarks include words, logos, and usually brands or service marks. Copyright, I'll go into it in a little bit more detail on the next slide, and that's the most relevant to storytelling. Moral rights are the personal rights of the author to be attributed, and we'll also touch on those in a little more detail. And then designs and patents include inventions and innovations, so aren't exactly relevant for today's discussion. Copyright exists automatically once an author creates a work, and it enables creators to manage how their work is used. In order to be protected by copyright, there are two prongs that need to be satisfied. The work needs to be in material form and it needs to be original. Material form means that copyright doesn't protect information, ideas, or concepts. And that importantly means that it doesn't protect stories that are told orally, even if those stories have been handed down through generations and are well known. They need to be, written or recorded to satisfy that requirement. They also need to be original. It doesn't mean that the work has to be innovative or artistic, but it needs to be attributable to that author's skill and labour. It can't be copied, for example. Copyright protection gives an author exclusive rights to reproduce their work, be the first person to publish a work, perform the work to the public, communicate the work to the public, and adapt the work. So as a general rule, the copyright owner is the creator of the material, unless that's varied through a contract. Two or more people can also jointly own copyright, which can happen in a couple of ways. There might be joint authors of a work, and that's if they've both jointly contributed and their contribution's inseparable from the other person, or they might have agreed that copyright will be jointly owned. And a common example of this would be a band, and they might jointly agree that they all own the band lyrics, even if only a couple of people wrote each song, for example. We've set out a few scenarios, and we can circulate this document, but we just thought it would be relevant to explain, for example, if an author writes down their story, that's when they would own copyright. But as Jen flagged, for example, if someone's filmed telling their story, then usually the maker of the film would own copyright in that. Or for example, if someone told their story on a broadcast, like a radio show, then it would be the maker of the broadcast that owns the copyright, just to give you a bit of a flavour. Authors might also have moral rights in their story, and that recognises their ongoing connection to the work. And these are quite relevant because they're still applicable even if an author doesn't still own the intellectual property in that work. The author of an original work has got the right of attribution, so to be named as the creator of a work, the right against false attribution, so not to have someone else's name associated with their story incorrectly, and the right of integrity, which is the right not to have the story used in a way that prejudices their reputation or their honour. In Australia as well, defamation law is relevant, and that will protect the reputation of an individual, so not a company or anything, who is alive. And the person needs to be identified in the publication directly or through the disclosure of enough facts that you know who's being talked about. And to prove that you've been defamed, the person needs to show there's been damage to their reputation and that they've been exposed to hatred, contempt, or ridicule. So the bar's high enough that just not feeling comfortable, for example, with a story that was published about you doesn't necessarily mean a defamation claim's going to be relevant or successful.
Thanks, Em. So as you can see from what Emily was saying, as a storyteller, if you've just told your story orally, there's not really much protection afforded to you in terms of intellectual property, because you haven't actually put that story into material form. You haven't written it. You haven't put it into the material form, which is what copyright attaches to. So if they don't have any IP rights in the story, that means that they don't have any moral rights. Moral rights are only relevant, again, it attaches to the author of the story, the person who wrote it down or the person who filmed it. So that only leaves what I was saying earlier, contracts. And what we have here is really just a standard template release, which we've seen. We haven't drafted this, just for before everyone thinks badly of us as the lawyers, but this is a really standard. So whenever somebody participates in a film or whatever, in a presentation, they'll sign something along these lines. I consent to being photographed, recorded, and/or filmed on the following terms. The company is going to own all the rights. The company can do pretty much anything with the recording of me, including for promotional, commercial, and marketing purposes, whether or not accompanied by narration or dialogue, at any time, anywhere. I waive all personal rights and objections I have to the company's use of it. I waive, release, and forever discharge the company and anyone related to the company from any claims that I may have, and I understand I won't receive any compensation or payment for this. So you're basically left with nothing and the company gets everything. So again, this is where the framework becomes really important, because not only are there little legal rights that arise automatically, the way that organizations generally work is they'll use these template type documents, which, to be frank, are quite hectic and leave very little room for the individual storytellers. So if we just have a look at the next slide. So that leads to the principles. We've included here the 5 principles that are current in the current draft. And again, this is still very much in draft stage. I won't read them to you, but they're just kind of to give you a flavor of the type of things that are in there. And each of the principles are then included with a description of what it is, what each principle means. And there's also a set of standards that underpin each of them. So for example, if you look at the 4th one, partners and storytellers will co-edit stories. So the standard and expectation of organizations who sign up to the principles would be that if they're gonna adapt the story or frame it in a certain way, it must be discussed and approved by the storyteller. So with our example of Michael, his situation wouldn't have occurred because he would have known how the story was going to be used and would have had a say in that. So just in terms of the ethical considerations that really underpin the principles and the things that are important for any organization that wants to operate ethically in terms of storytelling should consider, it would be a veto right if storyteller decides it no longer wishes to allow the story to be published, a right to view, edit the story and how it and the storyteller is presented prior to publication, limit what channels the story may be distributed to and what purpose the story can be used for, limit how long the story may be used and distributed, consider if storyteller wishes to be paid for sharing the story, and commit to certain resources. So for example, a translator to being available. So I guess that's just really a summary of where we're at so far. It's still very much a work in progress. And that's really all from us. We can, but it doesn't happen automatically. So we'll attach to the person who filmed it or recorded it. So they would need to actually sign an IP assignment deed. So they'll assign the IP over to the storyteller. So again, that it really comes back to contract. The position changes if you're an employee or a contractor. I guess we should point out, if you're an employee, then anything that you produce is automatically owned by your employer, unless again, you sign another contract changing that position. If you're just a contractor, you'd actually have to look at the terms of your contract agreement, your contractor agreement, and whether or not it deals with IP, because IP doesn't automatically assign over to the person that you're working for unless it says so in your contractor agreement.
I started to share with the group the issue around owning your own story. So sometimes you're asked to share your story without actually having through that process of owning your story, because particularly under-resourced communities, they're displaced in language, in culture, and even in experiences from a generational perspective. So sometimes you're asked to speak to something that you don't necessarily understand. And so therefore, it's really important for communities to be involved, under-resourced communities to be involved in autonomous storytelling, and where the facilitator, the teacher and the funding organisations is well represented in terms of identity, in terms of experience, and in terms of a nuanced understanding of what it means to share from a position of vulnerability and displacement.
I don't know, I just use a personal example that as a storyteller, I go in where I melt away my stereotypes. So I always try and create an inclusive and safe environment and try to listen more and attentively and not to judge and know that their stories are being heard. And I guess also as well that as Vincent and Raphael touched upon is that stereotypes is the biggest thing that we need to get rid of, because when we go into any scenario, we need to know what we need to let go of that, as Nicola said before, that we need to get rid of that neoliberalism thought and idea, and we're bombarded by it. And so when we use ethical storytelling, we're going in with a clean slate. We're going in there as a blank canvas, and we're going to listen to all these different colors that's going to be painted as a picture for us. And when we walk away from that, we need to know that this was shared by X, Y, and Z, and that we as a person or in any industry, we can use the framework of ethical storytelling and make other industries know that though it might take thousands of dollars of costs, at least we know that we've made that change now for that short term, but it has a longer, greater benefit in the long run.
We had sort of initial costs to transition to the new system and to redesign our policies, and we spent time looking at everything and the way we do it. What we've changed is that we now, when we are applying for funding, we actually transfer that cost onto the funder. We actually have started including a significant amount for additional edits and for all the things we didn't do in the past. So we, yeah, that's what we've sort of factored in. But initially, because we didn't have that money, we didn't think about all of these things. We had a few projects where we had to bear the cost and go into our reserves to cover that. But it's most of the costs are around time, the time it takes to like edit a video, to edit a publication, to have a project manager who will spend the time to talk to the young people and their families. Yeah, so that's most of the cost. If I could just add one thing, I really liked what Elizabeth said around language. I think language is so important in this space. And one thing that I notice all the time when people in Western Sydney prepare storytellers to come in front of an audience is that storytellers often come from a very traditional background. When I'm saying traditional, it's non-liberal, traditional as in Christian, Muslim, of a Buddhist, of a different faith, which is still very important to them. Their family structures are different, they have a different set of values. And the audiences are often liberal, and and they don't have to be white. Not everyone has to be white, but everyone has the same liberal education, and they have the same woke ideology, and they talk about the same things. What I see sometimes is that a storyteller becomes very vulnerable and uses language which sounds inappropriate to the audience members, because that person has no concept of the language that's used in liberal circles. And so there is a tendency to judge someone very quickly and say, this person is a homophobe, or this person is a misogynist, or this person is not aware of these important issues, which is not like the case. It's just that they come from a totally different context and have different values. And I think that we continuously have to acknowledge this and look at the essence of what that person is saying to us, not catch them out for the way they are saying certain things.
And also going back to that whole idea of liberal mindsets and more conservative mindsets, I think it's also good to position storytelling as very much a liberal and a Western, in a Western context, because like sharing your dirty laundry or like telling people your story is actually not very, I guess, second nature to many communities, many, I guess, under-resourced or cultural communities. Especially around topics like trauma, topics around sexuality, gender, relationships, love. And I guess we live in a climate where, diversity is, diversity is a buzzword, and many publishers and podcasts and organizations want more stories so that they gain a more richer clientele. But we also have to understand that sometimes if we publish those stories and that young person is unaware of the implications of that, and that story reaches their community, there is a potential for that person to feel, psychologically impacted by that, and also in conflict with their own community. So their sense of identity actually shifts because they haven't had that process to talk to their community, or share their version of the story with their community before actually, giving it to this organization or to this platform.
So thanks everyone for what you have been discussing and contributing. It's been really interesting. I just wanted to make a bit of a comment, around the value of having this framework and principles, and that balance off, I think, kind of feeds back into what we were just mentioning about people not being seen just as storytellers, but then the broader experience that they can add. In the work that I've been doing involved at Red Cross, storytelling is one aspect of how we will want to have people at the forefront, nothing about us without us, hearing the voices of those who we're talking about. But it's also about that broader lived experience of all perspectives being the whole package, and how do we ethically engage with that and utilize that and embed that. And there's a lot out there about lived experience experts, like in the mental health sector, particularly, but in other industries as well, as that kind of professionalization, like a professional lived expert. And so the storytelling really is quite a different role there. And so this is, I think, would be very complementary to organizations that work in community, to look at how they can use that. So I see it as to be a really great development. And so many people work in this sector with the best of intentions, but we're constantly learning all of the time. You look at how so much of our language generally has changed in the past 5, 10, 15 years. It's a constant evolution to be doing things ethically. So yeah, really excited to see just, a few organisations on this call today about how they are continually evolving and responding and walking on that journey. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there.
I suppose it's what it has done for me, I suppose. I've seen myself as a storyteller, and before I was writing in the comments maybe about an hour ago, and I don't see myself as an expert storyteller or anything like that. I think I'm always wanting to thrive and strive to be. I'm always learning, but within that, the framework for the transformational ethical framework has made me realize, and it sort of made me realize how I see myself as a storyteller, but then also how organizations and institutions utilize the story and the people that hold them and the storytellers. And these organizations that we've dealt with previously up to now, they lack responsibility. I think that was sort of clear. That's emerging out of what we're doing with these workshops and webinars, but also when we have people that share the framework as well. And it's made me realize as well, all the previous times I've engaged with institutions, whether my background is in performing arts and in the written text as well, and it's made me realize about all the times that an organization or institution has taken my story, but also I think it's just abuse, really, right? it's abuse. The abuse of me as a person, as a Gumarai man, but also the abuse of the story, because it's been modified. They take your story and they turn it inside out, and then they present it, and you have no say in it whatsoever. It's a long established construct that has been happening since day dot, even since colonization, you know. And they think it's the best way of sharing your story. They think it's the best way to share your culture. It's the best way to share your trauma. Yeah? They think it's the best way. They don't. They never have. Your stories will always be modified unless there's genuine collaboration. And if that's not existing and working in unison, then we're gonna, your stories and the people that you advocate for, with if you're in an organization or representing an organization, I can, for me as a black fella, you know, there's been that long history of our story, and it's been hijacked by white people, and then it's you know, it's a little bit of the power shift that's changed over the years, and it was up to a point of consultation. I will, you know, be in consultation with First Nation people, with blackfellas, Aboriginal people, then we'll still modify your story. I think that era is over. There has to be over. I'm more aligned and wanting and pushing for the era of collaboration. And collaboration has always been kind of wide-eyed and staring back at us in the wings off to the stage, you know? And it's their time to get out there and shine, because the outcomes of those exchanges as a storyteller and the organization that represents you or will intend to represent you, that's positive change. We want to be included rather than be excluded, yeah? Transformational ethical storytelling works for me, and it's made me think in the last 2 years, because it's a positive engagement. It redresses and values me, and I see more of the value. You know, we're all striving to get our stories out there, and it values me more than previous ways of thinking and engagement. And it values my story, and we want to be respected. All of us want to be respected for who we are, but also the content of our stories and how it's measured. And ultimately, through this framework, it's beneficial for both.